all sensory inputs to whoever was in here. Initially, any of the subjects that were in there tried to just bide their time by thinking of their homework. These are all students. They were told to stay in as long as they could. I don't think anyone lasted more than 2 or 3 days. And the general result was that they found out that with only a few simple tools, you can induce psychosis within 48 hours, simply by blocking out all sensory input. Dr. Maitland Brown, Baldwin rather, who had been working with Hebb as well, also then went back and did it with some soldiers in the army, and found that after 40 hours, soldiers were crying loudly and kicking their way out. Dr. Cameron, who this quote was from, well, not this quote, but this information, adapted Hebb's work. He had been doing his own work where, how do I best put this? His notion was that he was working with schizophrenia, and his thought was that in order to restore health, you need to completely depattern. So he was in search of sort of the actual physical blank slate. We can break your mind down to nothing, we can build you back up from there. Which is interesting in a discussion of ethics. Cameron didn't feel he was doing anything unethical because he felt that this was the way you're going to achieve mental health anyway. We need to break you down to a blank slate completely to build you back up. So there is no violation of the Hippocratic Oath for him, his psychiatrist, as far as he is concerned. But his procedures were psychic driving, which is kind of a comical thing that's used for very different reasons now, which was that once you're broken down completely, then we're going to play constant tape loops with whatever we want to then imprint over and over again, which didn't really work. Instead, now we use it, I'm going to say we, to continue the breaking down process, like we use Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera and rock music and things, blaring loudly, which is also to help prevent sleeping and whatnot, but it's also related to the same technique here. So the first stage, they're depatterned, which meant they were reduced to a vegetative state through a combination of massive amounts of electroconvulsive shock, drug-induced sleep, sensory isolation, and deprivation. When they were fully depatterned, patients were incontinent of urine and feces, unable to feed themselves, and unable to state their name, age, location, or the current date. In the second stage, psychic driving was introduced, consisted of hundreds of hours of tape loops being played to the patient through earphones, special helmets, or speakers in the sensory isolation room. The loops were meant to be statements of purported psychological significance initially. However, when he started receiving funds from the military, when they became aware of his research for the CIA, they came up with his research and they sent him up to McGill, they gave him a ton of funding, and the psychic driving then switched, and instead we've got, instead it became things about incest and parental disapproval. What do you want to get to this other bit? Okay, so his program, once he was at Allen Memorial, was breakdown ongoing patterns of behavior with intensive electroshock, and he used the Page-Russell, which six successive shocks at doses of 30 to 40 times what you use for clinical treatment, repetition of verbal signals 16 hours a day for 6 to 7 days while in sensory isolation. Regression, and then in order to repress that stage, patients were put into a coma for 7 to 10 days, and in some cases much longer. So between 1957 and 1963, he treated, do air quotes on that one hand, 100 patients admitted with moderate emotional problems in his studies that were meant to be about treating schizophrenia. In terms of other research that's going on during the same period, and when I'm mentioning names, in 1977, there was a Senate hearing on MKUltra. They declined to list any names because the notion is that the CIA, while funding this research, was not funding it directly. And so the thought was that they didn't want to ruin a bunch of budding psychologists' careers if they didn't know that this was where the money was coming from. You can leave that up to yourself. But it's not that difficult to find out who was working on it because most of this research was still published. And if you know, there's a whole cohort of psychologists that were either working on their dissertation or working on research at the same time at the universities that were awash in money. Hinkle and Wolf in 1953 and 54 at Cornell, they were researching KGB techniques related to stress positions and no-touch torture, which I'll briefly state in a moment. I think I'm already going long. Milgram with his Yale obedience studies, Seligman with learned helplessness, which is certainly useful. Also J.B. Overmere and Stephen Mayer working with him at University of Penn. Zimbardo, well, he was in 1971, but still useful in terms of when we're looking at ongoing efforts. And actually, there's actually a really good documentary that's out, but it's difficult to get your hands on. The Human Behavior Experiments, which talks about Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment and the current problems in Guantanamo. So in 1963, the MKUltra program was shut down, and the Kubark manual appeared the following year, so it became pretty clear where all this information was going. Which the overarching point of Kubark is about regression, about achieving the suspended animation, or as it was referred to in one of the things, the torturer's sweet spot, when the source is far more open to suggestion and likelier to comply. And these methods, the methods that are in Kubark are pretty clear and still in use now. Early morning arrests, hooding, intense isolation, drugging, forced nudity, electroshock, deliberately induced regression. And it also includes a long list of psychological profiles to help you match the appropriate techniques to the appropriate detainee. And so when I'm talking about these techniques and talking about my skepticism regarding whether or not these things were reverse engineered throughout our recent history, since 1945, since the 1950s, the CIA has been training other governments in using the techniques. When I put up this thing that was discussing the coups, economic reform for many countries, especially where we've been involved, has come also with torture. When we talk about the Korean War in 1950, 1953, CIA was there helping train interrogators in Brazil, 1964 coup, Chilean coup in 1973, which actually that has more of a local twist since, like right here, since the University of Chicago economists from there were very much involved in orchestrating the Chilean coup and setting the repressive principles that followed. Argentina, 1976 to 1983, on Honduras in the 80s, and that one we know for sure, obviously, since we created a new manual for that particular purpose. Okay. I suppose rather than, I'm also supposed to tell you things that you can do, but but I'll briefly just list off the techniques, and then maybe I'll say something what we can do before we break. But when you hear the terms no-touch torture, like the media for a while when Abu Ghraib was breaking, like they kept talking about torture light. They talk about, they love to talk about waterboarding because it's physical. It's something people can envision that. Talk about sensory isolation, people are like, what does that matter? In fact, even when Rumsfeld was approving the new, the more intensive techniques, he had written down, he had indicated, I don't understand why we can only do forced standing for 6 hours. I stand at my desk 8 hours a day. Why is this bad? But the notion is that if you're inflicting physical pain on someone in an interrogation, their reaction is going to be subjective. It's based on what they believe about the pain. You can manipulate that. But in terms of isolation, sleep deprivation, fatigue, the effects are intrinsically harmful. And so the notion is, well, where is this? The notion is that the interrogator can delude themselves into thinking that they're doing nothing to you, and any pain that you feel as the person being detained, you feel you're inflicting upon yourself.